All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Greetings from a not very warm and not very sunny London. I wish I could be there with you to give this presentation. Hopefully, we can resume our in-person meetings soon, but at the moment, it is what it is. I'm very honoured to have been invited to participate in this first Saudi virtual symposium. So thank you very much indeed to Dr. Lamis and the conference organizers for inviting me. So it's a first for the Saudi conference, and it's a first for World Behaviour Analysis Day. So happy World Behaviour Analysis Day, everyone. As you probably know, today was chosen because it would have been Skinner's birthday, and he would have been 117 years old today. So happy birthday, Fred. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about the history of credentialing in particular as it leads to the professionalization of the field. I want to give a little bit of background and rationale about the Bacb's decision at the end of 2019 to discontinue offering Bacb certification around the world. And I want to talk briefly about steps that countries can take towards the professionalization of applied behavior analysis with obviously a specific focus on KSA. And I'm hoping to leave a little bit of time at the end for anyone to ask me any questions that you wish. So let's start with a history.
That may be beyond my abilities at the
Oh,
moment.
excuse me, my watch is talking to me. The idea of credentialing behavior analysts isn't a new phenomenon. It actually started to be discussed in the 1970s, and indeed Minnesota had their own in-state certification program in the mid-1970s. And at that point, they even had designations for a whole range of professionals, from what is now the equivalent of a behavior technician all the way through to a senior behavior analyst. I think there were 7 or 8 separate designations for professionals. At the end of 1970, Florida had its own certificate program, not certification program, that came later, and that lasted a few years. ABA, well then ABA, now ABAI, had a certification program briefly. One of the reasons that stopped, I believe, was because one of the ways that people were assessed was through free text responses, and there was some concern about the objectiveness of that. In the mid-80s, the Florida certification program started, and that ran all the way through to 2003. And actually, when the Bacb started, it came directly out of the Florida certification program. Jerry Shook and Michael Hemingway, who were in Florida at the time, wanted to start something that was national rather than state specific. And in 1998, started the Bacb. And for the first few years, the examinations for Bacb certificates or would-be certificates was actually the Florida examination. So when I took the exam in 2002, it was the Florida exam that I took. And not that this is credentialing as such, but as part of this history, within the last decade or so, there has been a rise in the number of US states that have licensure, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when the Bacb first started, it was intended to be a national certification program for behavior analysts in the United States. In addition to the Florida program, there were 4 other states, I believe, that had their own state-specific certification program. But it was very much the intention, certainly from Jerry Shook and Michael Hemingway, for the Bacb to amalgamate those programs and offer a national certification program in the United States. And at that time, in order to start this, the standards that they set, the requirements to apply, were much broader than they currently are. And that was very deliberate in order to start something and develop critical mass within the US in order for certification to take off. And the history of this has been written about in a number of different outlets. And here is one in the journal Behavioral Interventions, published in 2001. Now, there were a couple of key international events, and given my role, Director of International Development, I do want to focus on the international slant to all of this. The first Bacb certificate from outside the US was actually certified in 2000. And actually, this was a friend and colleague of mine who went on with me to start the first Bacb verified course sequence outside of the US, in the UK at that time. And we established that in 2002, and that was a BCABA course sequence. In 2004, the Bacb, acknowledging the international interest, appointed by mandate its first international director. So the bylaws at that time dictated that there should be at least one non-US director on the board. And in 2004, that was Joel Hundert from Canada. In 2012, the Bacb translated its BCABA exam into Chinese in response to a request from individuals in China to make that accessible. Now, in 2014, the Bacb Board of Directors had a 2-day strategic planning meeting, which I attended. At that time, I was on the Board of Directors, so before I became employed by the Bacb. And the strategic planning meeting was run by a behavior analyst who had expertise in strategic planning. And one of the first things he had all of the board of directors do was to write down on yellow sticky notes individually what we felt our top 5 priorities for the Bacb ought to be over the next 5 to 10 years. And everyone, so it was completely unanimous, wrote down international development. And that led to us brainstorming and writing or drafting our global mission and our global vision statements. The mission was and still is fundamentally about consumer protection, specifically to protect consumers of behavior analysis services worldwide by systematically establishing, promoting, and disseminating professional standards. And that is what we have done and continue to do. The global vision, and I'm paraphrasing here, is to save the world with behavior analysis. There are so many issues to which behavior analysts could and should turn their attention that it makes the growth in the profession even more pressing. So to name just a few, of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and one of the ways out of that is to change the way we behave. We have also issues related to nationalism and counterterrorism and addiction issues, and of course, general education issues. There are so many areas to which behavior analysts could and should, as I say, turn their attention. And of course, I should also say that it is still the case that many people around the world, including people that I meet on a fairly regular basis, when I tell them I'm a behavior analyst, they assume automatically that I work within the field of autism, because that is how they have heard about applied behavior analysis in particular. And I think that is both a blessing and a curse. So it's something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is fantastic that now I meet people around the world, and not necessarily in the context of any professional engagement. And when I tell them I'm a behavior analyst, they have heard of that, or at least they have heard of applied behavior analysis, ABA. So that's great. But on the other hand, there is an assumption that that is quintessentially associated with autism. And that's an issue and a problem that I think remains to date and has hindered our growth in many areas. Anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a digression. Okay, some more key international events. In 2014, following our strategic planning meeting and unanimous agreement that international development should be a key strategic goal, the Bcb decided to mandate an additional international director for the board of directors. So now, and currently, there must be 2 people from outside of the US on the board of directors, at least 2. We specifically added international development as a strategic goal area. The Bcb appointed a full-time director of international development, and that was me. And I was supported specifically to support the international activities and dissemination and other activities that we had discussed during this meeting. Actually, what happened is during the meeting, and because I was the international director at the time, after the meeting, everyone talked to me and said, Neil, because we have decided that international development is a key strategic area, and because you are the international board representative, perhaps you could start to put together a plan for how that might happen. And I thought about it, and then I told everyone that it wasn't something that could happen based on voluntary participation from individuals, and that the Bcb probably ought to think about hiring someone to focus on that kind of work. And that led to some interest in terms of hiring me, and to avoid a conflict of interest situation, I developed an international plan, I submitted it to the board, and then I resigned at least 6 months before they even discussed the plan, so that if they did make that decision to offer me the job, then it would be not on the basis of me being there and being involved in the decision about the plan. And that is how I ended up working for the Bcb. In 2015, we also decided to authorize 12 additional languages that the BCBA and BCABA examinations would be translated into. And I will show you some data later, but as it stands, we have the examination available in 8 languages to date. At that point, and I looked at the data, Bcb staff had traveled to more than 100 events and meetings around the world across 40 different countries to provide support for international development. So between 2014 and 2019, I have certainly traveled to more than 40 countries to speak at conferences and meet with universities and individual groups, and provide all sorts of support to help disseminate behavior analysis and start university programs and so on. Now, in 2019, at the end of 2019, we made some announcements that came as a surprise to a number of people I know. we announced that from January the 1st, 2023, so just over 20 months away, Bacb certification applications would no longer be accepted from those that reside outside of the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. Actually, when we made the announcement, it was restricted to the US and Canada, but we also announced at the time that we would accept applications from countries who still wished to access Bacb certification from within that country. And we have had a number of applications, and the UK and Australia are the two that to date have been successful in their applications. So from January the 1st, 2023, only individuals that live in the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia may apply for examination eligibility. And that is all examinations, Bcba, Bcaba, and the RBT exam. We also announced that from the beginning of next year, so January the 1st, 2022, the Bacb examinations would no longer be offered in the various languages that we had translated them into, and only be offered in English. Now, you may wonder why there's a 1-year discrepancy between these two announcements. And the reason was that from the beginning of next year, we will have new examinations based on the 5th edition task list go into effect. And it was felt by the board of directors that it would be particularly onerous and time consuming to translate all of the examinations into all of the languages just for 1 year only. And so it made sense just to discontinue the translated examinations from that point. So that is why the translated examinations finish at the end of this year. We also announced at the same time that effective immediately, so from December 2019, when we made the announcement, that we would reallocate resources to assist organizations, national behavior analysis organizations, ideally, to develop their own standard systems and credentialing programs, if that is what they wish to do. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, let me show you some data. I appreciate that these are a little old. I pulled them from our database on January the 4th, just because they were all accessible from all countries at that point, and it was easier to pull one set of data than do a deep dive into every country's individual sets of data. But what this graph shows you is the increase in the number of BCBAs and BCABAs as we move forwards in time. Almost exponential rise. So with an increasing slope, it's very difficult to predict on this basis if and when we will reach the steady state in terms of the number of applications we will receive. And it remains the case that over the last few years, we always receive more applications than we have the previous year, are surprised by that and wonder whether it can continue. And it has continued even over the last 10 years, that we get more and more applications every year. So in terms of the number of BCBAs and BCABAs, we are at around 50,000 worldwide. Now, having said that, if we remove the approved countries, in other words, the countries that will continue to have access to Bacb certification from 2023. So here I have taken out the data from the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. And here are how many we have left around the rest of the world. And you can see that the numbers are considerably smaller relative to the totals. So, and actually there's been a slight drop in the last couple of years. well, in the number of BCABAs, but a rise in the number of BCBAs. So around 2,000 BCBAs and BCABAs outside of the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. And just to compare that as a proportion, that is 4.5%, only 4.5% of the total of the close to 50,000. Now, part of my role up until we made the announcement was to encourage more and more individuals around the world to become BACB certificants, and to encourage more universities around the world to offer behavior analytic training, and ideally offer a behavior analytic training that would fulfill our coursework requirements for people to pursue BACB certification. And the numbers have increased proportionately. So we have seen the same rise in the number of individuals becoming certified around the world. But that proportion has not really changed at all. So it's always been around 4.5% of the total number. So it still remains a very small proportion. Now, just to display those data from the largest numbers on the left to the smallest numbers on the right, what this graph shows you is just how many countries have very, very small numbers of certificants indeed. So we have certificants outside of the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia in 89 separate countries. And those countries on the left that have the highest numbers of certificants are China, Italy, South Korea, Ireland, UAE, Israel, France, sorry, I'm turning my head sideways so I can read this, New Zealand, Germany, and India. And I have marked in the data for KSA there, so you can see where that is. But at the right end tail of the graph, there are too many countries to display. So I have just marked the countries that have 3, 2, and 1 certificates. And there are 12 countries that have 3, 11 that have 2, and 17 countries that have 1 certificate. So 40 countries have 3 or fewer certificates. And I have had a number of conversations with individuals in those countries who are fighting a lone battle to, for example, start university training there. And that is something I have turned my attention to over the last year or so. You're probably wondering about the growth in KSA in particular. Well, here are those data, at least from 2013. And as you can see, in 2020, at least, at the end of 2020, there were 28 BCBAs and 9 BCABAs. Now, I know that number has increased slightly, especially as we have moved to on-demand testing. Okay, I'd like to give you a little bit of the rationale for, given our commitment to international development, why the BACB made the announcement it did. But I suppose that the rationale for making the commitment to international development in the first place was really predicated on the fact that we know that the behavioral principles are universal. They have generality, and therefore, in theory, a global behavior analyst certification program ought to be potentially more feasible for applied behavior analysts than perhaps for other professions, perhaps. However, after a number of years of operating around the world, after a number of years of extensive research, training, including from those in the certification industry, and consultation with certification and testing experts, we decided to make the changes that we did. We made that announcement. And there were three main rationales for making that announcement, and they are displayed here. So the viability for having global requirements for the profession, whether Bcb certification requirements were appropriate for some countries and not for others, and whether global certification programs were able to meet accreditation standards. So let me talk about the first one, the viability of global requirements for the profession. It is the case that no other major profession, whether it be medicine, psychology, accounting, law, and others, none of those have one set of global standards. And there have been many challenges that we have faced over the years associated with operating in different countries. One of which was related to language barriers, but not the only one by any means. Now, because we acknowledge that to be truly global and to disseminate and develop internationally would require that we offer the translated a translated version of the exam, we made the decision to translate into 12 languages, as I said earlier. We currently have 8, and they are Chinese, Spanish, Hebrew, Italian, Brazilian, Portuguese, Korean, Russian, and Polish. And the other ones we had planned were French, Arabic, Hindi, and I can't remember, Japanese. And the reason we chose those 12 languages was because that, according to the analysis, would have covered about 85% of the population in terms of the languages spoken. Now, to be truly global, though, would have required that we offer all of our certificants and applicants the same experience in terms of how they apply, how they correspond with us, and so on and so forth. And what we realized is that really would have required the translation of all of our resources and documents, not just the examination. So that would have involved translation of, for example, the website, our newsletters, our mass email communications, the certificate gateway, and to offer telephone and email-based customer support in the different languages. And as you can imagine, that was an incredibly challenging proposition. Now, the data in this table show the number of first-time test takers for the Bcba examination in the languages that we currently have available. And what you can see is that the numbers are very small in some cases. And actually, the numbers in these highlighted boxes represent examinations in those languages that are so low in volume that it would have been a confidentiality issue for us even to have reported those data, and certainly not to conduct the kind of psychometric analysis we need to conduct in order to ensure that our examinations are weighted equally and appropriately. Now, so what I mean by a problem with the confidentiality issue, if you only have a couple of people take the exam in a particular language, it would fast become obvious which 2 people took the exam in that language within the community in that country. And if one passed and the other failed, that would be a big problem in terms of people knowing about that and so on. Now, still talking about the viability of global requirements, a global certification program also requires that the eligibility and maintenance requirements are legally defensible in each country. And that includes the protection of things like intellectual property, trademarks, and other things. It also requires that ethics requirements are enforceable in all of the different countries. And that has been problematic. It also requires that there are secure test sites available in each country. and that there are simply not, in some countries, secure test sites. That there is compliance with each country's privacy laws, and they differ from country to country and change frequently, and compliance with each country's examination and accommodation laws. So, for example, accommodations related to some kind of disability. And this is an important one, that regulators and relevant government agencies within the countries recognize the certification standards and credentials as being relevant to that country and the practitioners within the country. And it really remains the case that has not happened, and Bacb certification is only recognized in countries by those that have Bacb certification or are pursuing certification, but certainly not at national level, sadly. Okay, the second rationale was our consideration about whether the Bacb certification requirements were appropriate for some countries and not for others. Now, some context for that. The Bacb requirements have really evolved against the backdrop of what has been happening mainly in the US, but also to some extent in Canada. When the Bacb first started offering credentials 22 years ago now, as I said earlier, the requirements were intentionally broad because that was what the US infrastructure could support at the time. But even then, the growth rate was relatively slow. There are two key variables that have significantly impacted the growth rate, which, as I showed you in the data earlier, are now near exponential. The first is that behavior analysts who work within the field of behavioral intervention for autism are able to claim reimbursement for their services through health insurance. And that is now the case in 100% of states. And that is quite an incredible achievement when you think about it, because we are talking about insurance companies. And insurance companies are notorious for not wanting to pay for things if they can possibly avoid it. So the fact that every state has been persuaded by the evidence, the unequivocal evidence base for the effectiveness of behavioral intervention for individuals with autism is a testament to the work of the individuals that have done that campaigning in the US. But that is not the case elsewhere. But that in and of itself has led to a huge increase in the number of people wanting to pursue certification. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see that at least in January, 64%, so 37 US states had licensure. I think it's more now. And in all cases, the licensure is either based on Bacb certification directly or references Bacb certification. And that has also been a huge driver for growth in terms of the number of people pursuing Bacb certification in the United States. And these drivers for growth simply do not exist in other countries. And yet, individuals in those countries are now required to meet the standards, the Bacb's current standards, which have changed markedly over the last 2 decades. We have also received fairly frequent feedback that the Bacb's Professional and Ethical Compliance Code is not sufficiently sensitive to some of the different practices and cultural differences across different countries. And that's an issue that can only really be addressed by the development of country-specific ethics requirements and probably country-specific standards. Just to give you a comparison, I talked about the fact that we're not sure if and when we will reach the steady state. The profession of occupational therapy in the United States could probably be described as at its steady state, because here you see the number of examination candidates applying each year, at least in 2016, 17, and 18. So not much differences between them. And so in 2018, just over 17,000 people applied for an occupational therapy credential. The top grid is the occupational therapy qualification itself, and the lower one, and I can't remember the acronym, it's the assistant level of occupational therapy. So there, in 2018, they had just over 17,000 applications. In 2018, and bear in mind, this is now 3 years ago, and our growth is exponential. We had close to 52,000 applications in 2018. And we still don't have the professional infrastructure, even in the United States, to support that kind of growth. And that's something that we're playing catch up with constantly. Okay, the third rationale is whether global certification programs were able to meet accreditation standards. Now, to be a truly global credentialing organization requires, as I said earlier, that all applicants and certificates are provided with the same experience. And in terms of Bacb certification, that is a requirement from our accrediting body, the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, the NCCA. And here are the standards that we have to meet in order for our programs to be accredited. And when I say our programs, I mean BCBA, BCABA, and RBT programs. And to be accredited, they must be consistent with established testing, certification, and legal standards. And having accreditation, in this case NCCA accreditation, is one of the main reasons that Bacb credentials have been written into many laws and funding policies, including licensure in many states in the United States. Now, this slide shows the standards that we have to meet. There are 24 of them, but actually one of them is a general one, so really there are 23. But one of the overarching, well, an overarching accreditation standard is that certification requirements must be consistent, irrespective of location. And operationally, this means that the credentialing organization, in our case, the Bacb, cannot make country by country changes to the operation of its certification programs or standards. So, for example, to address some of the issues that have been raised through the research, training, and consultation that we've been engaged in. And that's unfortunate because we have been asked to make changes on multiple occasions by individuals and organizations who point out quite rightly that the standards are now too high for them to attain within many countries. However, to have started to make these kinds of adjustments would have been to jeopardize NCCA accreditation. And this was clearly an influential aspect of the board of directors' decision to make the announcement that it decided to make. Now, since we made that announcement, I have personally met with, face-to-face, via Zoom anyway, individuals and organizations in over 40 countries. And we have been discussing a variety of different supports that I through the Bacb, can offer, including consultation on credential development, research on regulatory variables and what the regulatory framework is in that country and how the profession should be developed in order to meet that, training on item writing activities, general standards development, and guidance on other infrastructure development. Now, I suppose I should say at this point that if there's anyone listening that still wishes to pursue Bacb certification, then I've told you what the deadline is. If you live outside of the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia, then you must complete all of the requirements and take and pass the examination by the 31st of December 2022. That is the cutoff date. Now, if you were, what would ordinarily happen is once you apply and become eligible, you are given a 2-year authorization in which to take the exam. That is not the case. Your authorization, if you are outside of the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia, will end on the 31st of December 2022. And there are operational reasons why that has to be the case. If you are applying next year, so from the 1st of January 2022, then you must meet the new 5th edition task list requirements and the new experience requirements. And basically that means additional hours of coursework and additional hours of experience. But if you are pursuing this, then this is a discussion to be having with your supervisor and your course sequence coordinator. Now let's talk about where we are in terms of 2021. And 2020 and currently 2021 have been very strange years for a number of reasons. But it remains the case that there is still growing interest and awareness of applied behavior analysis, at least, as I said earlier, in terms of its application to children with autism and developmental disabilities. And that is a worldwide phenomenon. In fact, there are some countries that I have visited where the entire behavior analytic workforce only work with children with autism and developmental disabilities. There are, of course, a growing number of individuals offering behavior analytic services, irrespective of whether they are appropriately trained and experienced and or qualified. And it is almost always the case that that group of individuals and organizations is much larger than the group of individuals and organizations that are appropriately trained, experienced, and qualified to provide behavior analytic services of whatever type. But the current situation is that there are no country-specific standards. Countries are working on this. I'm helping countries work on this, but no country yet has its own specific standards. There are no country-specific qualifications. There are, of course, degree programs in countries, including in KSA. But really what I'm talking about here are a combination of the standards and qualifications to practice as a behavior analyst. And there are no there is no country-specific recognition of behavior analysts as a distinct professional group in any other country yet. Now, in the United Kingdom, where I am from and where I live, we have been having ongoing discussions about having behavior analysts be recognized as a separate and unique group profession in their own right. And we have been having those discussions since 2005 or thereabouts. At the end of last year, so 15 years after that point, we have finally submitted an application to an organization called the Professional Standards Authority to officially recognize and make public the register of behavior analysts that the UK Society posts. And if that is the case, then behavior analysts by default become recognized as a separate profession in the United Kingdom. And we are hoping to have an answer on that within the next few months. And that will be wonderful if that happens for many reasons, but also because once we are recognized as a separate professional group in our own right, then we will have a seat at the table in order to discuss national guidelines, for example, for working with children with autism, for special education, and for some of the other applications of behavior analysis that I mentioned earlier. So I really hope that happens. So what should be next steps for countries? And again, these are the kinds of steps that are informing the kinds of conversations I'm having with many, many countries. So behavior analytic service provision needs to be regulated across different countries. But before it's regulated, it needs to be recognized. So the first step to professional recognition is professional recognition. To be recognized requires that there are agreed national standards from the behavior analytic community, probably through the country's National Behavior Analysis Association or organization. And it is not the case that all countries have agreement within their behavior analytic communities about what the standards should be or what the next step should be. And that is unfortunate. So there are a number of countries where there are different groups of behavior analysts who disagree on these things and who cannot work together to reach consensus on this. So agreement really requires that there is consensus from the community and, of course, support from other key stakeholders and organizations, so other professional groups. And of course, if there are large numbers of behavior analysts working with children, whether they're children with autism, developmental disabilities, or within general education, then parents are also key stakeholders in this. And there are many, 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 many more parents than there are behavior analysts. And if countries can mobilize the parents to ask for national recognition, then that's an incredibly helpful and useful way to go, and avoids the problem of behavior analysts being self-serving in asking, for example, the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education to recognize them. And actually, that's exactly what happened in the US. This the medical insurance reimbursement that came from parents advocating for behavior analytic services on behalf of the behavior analytic community. Okay, what about KSA in 2021? Well, and this is at least my understanding, so please forgive me if I'm wrong and correct me if I'm wrong at the end, but my understanding is that Bacb certification is only recognized in KSA as elsewhere by those that already have it or who wish to pursue it. There are certainly some schools, centers, and clinics that seek Bacb certificates because of the standards that those individuals have to meet and the standards that they have to maintain and all of those things. But there is no formal recognition of Bacb certification or of behavior analysis in general, behavior analysts in general. But that is no different to the rest of the world. Major professions in KSA are regulated through the Saudi Commission for Health Specialties or through the Education and Training Evaluation Commission. And my understanding is that behavior analysts in KSA have already started to pursue recognition of the profession through the Saudi Commission for Health Specialties as a health specialty specifically. And I would like to say here and now and publicly that the Bacb will support you with that. So please let us know what help and support you require to pursue that goal. Okay, some final thoughts. The world needs more behavior analysts. I think that really goes without saying. I mentioned earlier the pressing need for there to be behavior analysts to address so many of the world's problems, including things like gambling, drug addiction, the growing elderly population, global warming, the pandemic. I mean, there are so many issues. This is really a call to action. Individual countries need to develop their own infrastructure to support and maintain training and experience requirements. And I would argue that really the starting point for the development of professional infrastructure is to have university training in the country. And that is something that KSA currently has. So that's fantastic. Many countries do not have that. They do not have university training programs offering behavior analytic training at postgraduate level or at any level. To establish applied behavior analysis as a distinct profession and behavior analysts as a distinct group of professionals requires recognition and regulation at national level, as I just mentioned. And as I also mentioned, the Bacb is ready, willing, and able to help. And we can help in terms of our experience, our expertise in setting standards and designing systems, facilitating the completion of job task analyses, and even providing some financial support for specific initiatives that countries are pursuing in their goal to establish the profession. So thank you very much. And again, happy World Behavior Analysis Day. And I would be very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for a very, very informative session. I think we're all very excited to hear all that information. And you answered many of the questions that us behavior analysts have been thinking, especially with regards to the rationale behind, the 2023 decision. We do have 2 questions here in the Q&A. Someone is asking, does an autistic child need 5 hours of ABA every day?
That's an impossible question to answer. Well, the research literature suggests very strongly that the more hours you have, the better the outcomes. Now, having said that, there is a difference between the hours that you are providing in general terms in order to address skill deficits and address behavioral excesses versus a very specific targeted intervention for a specific issue. So it may be that 5 hours of intervention from a behavior analyst on a very specific issue may be sufficient, but ultimately the answer to that is it's an empirical question, and I could only answer that in terms of whether the data show me that that either I or whoever is providing the intervention is being effective in that period of time.
Great. We have another question. I'm assuming it's about 2023. Can we become a Bcba D after that date?
Yes, if you are already a BCBA, then yes, absolutely. The Bcba D is not a certification, it's a designation. So the only certification programs we have are RBT, BCABA, and BCBA. So if you are already a BCBA before the deadline, that's fine. Then you can become a BCBA D whenever you wish. But you can't become a BCBA D until you are a BCBA.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Another question, is RBT essential to become an ABA therapist?
Well, no. And people may be horrified for someone from the Bacb to say that, but please don't forget that Bacb certification is simply an indication that you have met minimal standards. And that is one reason why I am dismayed to find out from some individuals that because the Bacb will no longer be offering certification, that they are thinking about discontinuing their university training programs. Because the two are, well, they're kind of related, but not. I mean, countries still need to train behavior analysts. So just because Bacb certification is not available does not mean they shouldn't continue to train behavior analysts. And also, it does not mean that countries cannot develop their own standard systems and possibly their own credentials. And so what is required to be a good therapist is to have good training and a good supervisor.
Thank you. That was music to my ears when you said don't stop the training programs, because that has been, we get a lot of questions about our master's program. Is this the final year you're offering the program? Is it going to stop after 2023? And it just doesn't make sense because, like I said, we need to train behavior analysts. Yes. Science.
Yes. And as I said, I will, if you need it, we will help and support you to develop your own standards and systems so that your university training program can lead to other specific qualifications if that's necessary and desirable. But please don't stop your training program.
We won't, I promise.
Good.
We have another question. It appears that this person had just started their master's degree based on the fixed task list. They're asking if they still need to finish up before 2023.
If they want to pursue Bacb certification, yes. They must meet all the requirements, so degree, coursework, and experience, and apply and take and pass the exam by the end of 2022. But if that's not possible, the training is not wasted. They still had the behavior analytic training, and as we just said, that's important. So don't not continue to pursue the training just because Bacb certification is no longer available.
Absolutely. Someone's asking, what about the Bcaba? Can they still become a Bcba after 2023 if they're already a Bcaba?
No, because that is a certification program, and no certification programs will be available after 2020 or from 2023, unfortunately.
If I'm an RBT now, can I register for Bcaba before the deadline, or will I not be able to make it?
Well, I mean, if you are able to complete the coursework and you have a bachelor's degree and meet the experience requirement before the end of 2022, you can make it. But if not, you can't. But that's a discussion to have with your supervisor and the university providing your coursework.
Great. Someone's asking, could we renew our certification after 2023?
Absolutely. Anyone who has any of our certifications before the deadline, they keep it as long as they want, forever. Of course, they have to meet the maintenance requirements and have to recertify. So as long as they continue to do that, that's fine. But yeah, no one will lose it. This is this is that no more individuals will have access to it if they live outside of those 4 countries from 2023.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Sure, sure.
Upon releasing the announcement in December 2019, it was declared by the Bcb that the reason for allowing Canada to continue having access to certification was due to the similarity with the US in terms of laws and regulation. So if you could just highlight the reasons for only allowing the UK and Australia to continue having their certification post 2022 as well.
Okay, well, I mean, I can't go into too much detail because it's quite a complicated process, but when a country applies, we have that country quite rigorously vetted by legal experts who look at the similarity between the legal and regulatory frameworks. They look at our ability to, for example, protect ourselves against copyright infringements and intellectual property theft, and there are a whole range of things. In the case of Australia and the UK, there were many similarities between the legal and regulatory frameworks compared to those in Canada and the US. But actually, I should say that, and this is public knowledge anyway, that the UK merely has an extension. It doesn't have indefinite access to BACB certification. And the reason for that is because the UK specifically asked for, it asked for an extension, and it asked for an extension because it's pursuing professional recognition, which I mentioned during my presentation. And it didn't want to be in a position where BACB certification ended and it didn't yet have its own systems in place. And it has five master's programs in behavior analysis, and students had already registered in those by the time we made the announcement, some of whom wouldn't have finished in time. So it was also asking for a bit extra grace period, but it did have to fulfill our requirements to be similar in terms of the legal and regulatory frameworks anyway. So that's a short answer to that question.
That makes sense. One final question is, someone's asking if they're not, a US citizen or a Canadian citizen, but they happen to reside in either one of those countries, can they still get certified after 2023? Yes,
it's not about citizenship, it's about residency. Even if an individual was there, for example, on a work visa or they were studying there on a student visa, if they were resident in one of those countries, they can apply. Yes.
Okay, great. I think that's it for all of our questions. Yep, that's all. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. We really enjoyed this. I mean, if we had more time, I would probably come up with even more questions and keep you with us all day. But we really do appreciate your time and your effort. And this was really, really valuable to all of us. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you, and hopefully we'll see you soon. We will definitely need your support and take you up on that offer to help us, get started here in Saudi.
Well, I look forward to the point where I can come and visit you to offer that help and support in person.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.